Hi guys, we're back and we're going to talk about regeneration in the understory and the ability to survive in the understory of the forest. So let me share here. Okay, so understory tolerance is the ability to live in the understory, and then of course your ability to regenerate in the understory is going to have an impact on your ability to survive in that location. So sometimes understory tolerance is just referred to as tolerance. And usually if people don't specify and they're talking about tolerance, they're talking about the ability to grow in the understory. And or they're talking about a tolerant species or an intolerant species. That's usually what they're referring to. Sometimes this is also referred to as being shade tolerant. Because of course the understory of the canopy is more shady and has less light. But there's other factors like differences in moisture that are true of conditions in the understory rather than in the open that are kind of incorporated into being able to survive in this location. So understory tolerance is really a better term to describe it. So this environment has some good, easier things to survive, and it has some more difficult things to survive. So it's not necessarily better or worse, but it's a different microclimate than being out in an open area, and a plant needs to either be adapted to live there or it needs to find a different place to live. So an ability of a plant to establish and grow in this kind of microclimate that we find in the understory may be diminished as a result of low light, like I already mentioned. Also, as a result of perhaps less soil moisture, so interception of rainwater from the leaves and the canopy of the forest above might prevent a lot of moisture from getting down to the forest floor underneath the forest canopy, so it might be too dry for plants to be able to establish. There also just might be more competition both for water and for nutrients in the understory that might make it more difficult for a plant to be able to survive. And the outcome is that some plants are adapted to live in these kinds of lower light, sometimes drier conditions, and other plants are not. So again, there's no judgment. It's not like a good or a bad thing. It's just, there's just differences that some plants have adaptations for and some plants do not. Okay, so going back to what we talked about a couple weeks ago, the light is necessary for plants to be able to photosynthesize. That's how they gain energy. But plants also respire. They also use up energy that they make through photosynthesis by burning that energy, those sugars in their cells, to do all the different kind of metabolic processes and grow like plants are able to do. And then we introduced this idea of compensation point, and we said the compensation point is the point where there's adequate light so that the plant can photosynthesize at least at the same level that it is able to respire. And when it's perfectly at its compensation point, there's no plant growth. And then if the plant is able to photosynthesize in excess of the rate at which it's respiring, so it's able to build energy faster than it's using energy up, it's only at that point that a plant is able to grow. And we said this is not equal for all plants. Plants are adapted to use different amounts of light to be able to meet their compensation points. So certain plants need a lot of light and certain plants don't need a lot of light. So you can imagine that certain plants are going to be adapted to live in the understory where there's not a lot of light, and certain plants are going to be intolerant. They're going to need a lot of light to meet their compensation point. And we kind of use the analogy of like the Ferrari method and the Honda Civic method. So we said some plants really use a lot of energy all the time, and that allows them to have a lot of fancy photosynthetic equipment. And so if they're growing in the light, they can photosynthesize and grow really quickly. But then when the light disappears, they have this background level of respiration that's very high that causes them to then plummet below their compensation point in low light conditions. And then other plants that have kind of a lower rate of photosynthesis that they're able to achieve even when light is present, but they don't have a very high background respiration rate, and so they can meet their compensation point even in lower light conditions. Okay, so these tolerant species, which are kind of more in the Honda Civic model approach, they have a not very spectacular ability to photosynthesize. Generally, they photosynthesize at a lower rate, but they also have a lower background respiration rate. And so it's easier for them to meet their compensation point even when the conditions in the understory don't allow a lot of light in. So these species usually don't grow as quickly, but even if they're in full light, they won't grow as quickly, but they can survive for a really, really long time in conditions that might be intolerable to other plants. So white fir, here's a white fir seedling down here, is famous for being very well adapted to live in these low light conditions. Douglas fir is also pretty well adapted at this. Sugar pine is less well adapted at this. And then Pipo, which is a shorthand for ponderosa pine, is very badly adapted to live in the understory. It's very intolerant of these low light understory conditions. And then incense cedar is kind of a funny plant. It's the 5th mixed conifer, Sierra mixed conifer species, and it is really adapted at growing in a huge range of conditions. So it can grow in very open conditions very well, but can also grow in very shady conditions as well. Okay, so now these tolerant species have certain morphological characteristics. So that refers to kind of like their shape, how they grow. And these species that are tolerant tend to have broader leaves. And now you might think like, wait a minute, white fir doesn't really have a broad leaf. It has these skinny needles. But the way that those needles are displayed, particularly in the understory, is such that they're really spread out in a very broad horizontal fan, which positions them in a way to capture as much light as comes into the canopy as possible. Also, the needles tend to be retained on the branches for many years. So you'll have needles going all the way back along the branch close to the trunk of the tree. And that's different than what we'll see in intolerant species. And then also, the canopy of the tree tends to go down closer to the forest floor. So it retains needles farther back on the branches towards the trunk, and then it also retains branches filled with needles farther down towards the forest floor. So it has a lower height to live crown, we can call that. There's not a lot of height of trunk before you start to get branches with live needles. Then that's going to essentially be opposite to these intolerant species, these species that grow in these open conditions. And then these are species that are generally well adapted to growing in areas where there's disturbances that are removing the forest canopy. So like that might be fire or something else that's removing the forest canopy and opening it up the forest canopy. And so these plants, we already mentioned, have an ability to grow faster. They can photosynthesize at a faster rate than tolerant plants can. But the fact that they can photosynthesize faster is facilitated by the fact that they have more cells, more complex cells that require more energy to maintain. So they also respire, they also use up energy faster than their intolerant or than their tolerant counterparts. And so they have to be living in a higher light environment that allows photosynthesis to be happening at such a rate that they can meet their compensation point or their break-even point in terms of energy, and it requires more light for them to be able to do this. So yeah, they can grow faster, but it's at this cost of not being able to grow when light is not present. Okay, so the morphology of these species is going to be kind of opposite from the tolerant species. They tend to have smaller needles that are more bunched together, that aren't as spread out, or if it's a broadleaf tree, like a smaller, more waxy, potentially type of leaf, because they're not working hard to capture light as much as their tolerant counterparts. They also tend to shed needles or leaves more readily, so they'll have a more limited number of years of needle retention on branches. And that's because we know that if they're keeping needles, these needles are going to be respiring and wasting energy. And as they get older, if they're not able to photosynthesize enough to, make it worthwhile to hold on to them, the plant's going to be quicker to drop these needles. So that's true on the branches, and then it's also just true of the crown of the forest as well, the part of the tree that has branches with live needles. So it has a low percent crown volume, meaning there's going to be a much higher portion of the tree, a much taller portion of the tree that's just trunk, that doesn't have any live branches on it. And we could also refer to that as having a high height to crown base. So you have to go fairly high up on the trunk before you would get to the live crown base. Okay, so here's some pictures. So on the left, we have a fir tree, and on the right, we have a pine tree. So you can see in this particular example, the fir tree is holding needles all the way down to close to the base, whereas the pine tree has done what's called self-pruning. It drops off the branches that are lower down to the ground, again, because those branches grew earlier on, and then the needles that would have been on those branches are going to be not as successful. And this is also a fire adaptation as well, but we'll talk about that more later. And then the percent of the crown that's filled in with needles is going to be different. So here is a fir tree. It's bushier with more needles filling in the crown. And then a pine tree is going to be more spindly. And again, the pine tree doesn't want to hold on to needles that aren't really photosynthesizing really quickly. So it's going to be more quick to drop needles off closer to the trunk of the tree, but gives it a more open look. So a lower percent crown volume in intolerant species versus tolerant species. And then, as we mentioned, these intolerant species are going to be better adapted to live in environments where there's regular disturbance to the forest, and we're going to talk more about disturbance later in the semester. But fire is a disturbance that is historically a really important ecological part of forests in the Sierra Nevada and in many other places in the world as well. So before we had such a significant fire suppression apparatus built up in our country, we used to have lots of natural fire from lightning, fire that was put on the ground by humans and different Native American groups over time. And this fire would burn through the understory of the forest, and then hopefully there wasn't as much fuel on the ground because there was frequent fire just burning up the small trees and shrubs and down needles and branches. So there wasn't as commonly these big, huge, severe fires that were moving and killing everything in their path very quickly. But there would be little patches where the fire that was burning through the understory would burn up into the canopy and kill certain overstory trees and open up these gaps in the canopy. And this process then allowed sunlight to get in onto the ground to these little patches and allowed for the regeneration of these intolerant trees like ponderosa pine and like sugar pine. So currently, as we've worked really hard to suppress fire in an effort to protect forest resources, or at least we thought we were trying to protect forest resources, right? We don't want to burn down the inventory of trees we have, and of course to protect homes and communities. We've worked really hard to put fire out, and in the process, we've really limited the light access to the forest floor. And so you're having a lot of regeneration of fir in the forest, these tolerant species, and not a lot of regeneration of pine species, which historically were much more dominant in our forest. So we're shifting the composition of the forest to make it a different type of forest than existed here 100 or 200 years ago. And then, of course, at the same time, as all these fir trees are growing in, and then we're not burning them or removing them in any way, we're just making the forest that's left behind much more flammable because there's a lot more fuel in the forest. And when fires do happen, we've all seen in the news in the last couple of years, they're getting really big, really fast, and creating lots of hazardous and sometimes tragic situations. Okay, so we'll talk more about fire later on, but in terms of the regeneration of these intolerant species that was historically facilitated by fire, one of the things that forest managers are trying to do is they're implementing these things that are called group selection cuts. So group selection cuts are essentially mini clear cuts. So in California, clear cuts are usually up to about 20 acres in size. So that's the size of about 20 football fields. And a group selection cut is much smaller than that. According to the California Forest Practice Rules, it can be up to 2.5 acres, but it's often smaller than that, like the size of an acre, which is about the size of a football field. And so the thinning of the forest in these group selection cuts allows people to pull out some wood from the forest to make into lumber, but also then leaves behind this small patch that we think is fairly or has a resemblance to the kind of patch that would be naturally created in this ecosystem by fire in the past. And the extra light that's getting down to the forest floor in these environments allows for the regeneration of these intolerant species like pine and other intolerant species. So anyway, this is a forest management technique that allows us to consider the ecological conditions of the forest based on our understanding of the difference between intolerant and tolerant species. Okay, that's a good stopping point.